Great. So as I said, welcome to this panel on disability in science. I'm Angela Lamont and I am delighted to be chairing this event. And this is not just about talking. This is about getting you some personal insights, some practical ideas, and some things for you to take away. So thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you might be aware that today's panel is also part of our larger series of events on inclusion and diversity, which Pearson are running, taking us right up to the 9th of December. So do have a look at the other events as well, and I will drop a link to that in the chat when I get a minute to do so. But why do Pearson care about building a culture of inclusivity, and why should you care about diversity and inclusion for people who want to pursue an education in science and maybe go on to pursue a career in science? One thing we've known for decades is that we don't have enough scientists, and we hear people bemoan this fact over and over again, and it doesn't seem to change. Now, one of the reasons for that could be that there can be barriers that just make studying or pursuing science quite difficult, and so they miss out. Meanwhile, employers therefore are missing out because they then don't have the number or the mix of scientists that they need to help them be the best organization they can be and help them do their best work. And guess what? That means society is missing out as well. So inclusivity in education for science is a real win-win, because for the individual, it means more opportunities for them to study science and find a really fulfilling career, one that they will really enjoy. And for the employer, it brings them all the benefits that diversity and inclusion brings to an organization, which are, just to name a few, enhanced creativity and innovation, broader perspectives on their problems and their plans, and higher productivity, performance, and happiness in the workplace. And those things are all supported by scientific studies where the data is available. So no two people are the same. No two have exactly the same skill set or mindset or experience. And if we put all our skills and visions and experiences together and our personalities, we get more done and we get it done better. So today in this panel, I'd like to explore several things. Firstly, are there barriers to people with a disability studying science at school, at university, and then taking that on to start a career in a scientific field? And if there are barriers, how can educators, how can teachers and people working in schools and universities be the enablers? What practical things can be done? And why is it important to talk about this stuff? So to help me do this today, we have a marvelous panel of people who I will ask to introduce themselves in just a moment. And they're here to help us to see and understand those barriers, to give their insights and their experiences, but also to suggest some very practical ideas that can raise awareness. And we can take those away, and you can help raise awareness in your colleagues who may not be as far down the road of recognizing this as you are. And I can say that because you've signed up to this webinar. So this is something that is obviously already on your mind, but things are always easier when everyone's pulling in the same direction, aren't they? So feel free, while we have this event, to pick our panelist brains and what a panel of knowledge and experience it is. You will meet them in just a moment. Get them to delve into their experience, and let's get you what you need to take action. But equally, I would like to ask you what you think, and I will be asking you for your feedback, your comments, any practical ideas that you've come across to remove some of those barriers to someone with a disability studying science subjects at school and university. Because after all, we said that more minds equals more diversity equals better outcomes, right? So if we all pool our ideas, we will come out with a better outcome. So please chat freely in the chat box, give us your views, ask us your questions, and also a little bit later on, I'll be asking you to take part in some polls so we can get some opinions and information from you that way as well. So without further ado, please meet our awesome panel. We have Jessie Dufton, a patent engineer. We have Dr. Batul Dolby, an educational psychologist. We have Matt Mears, senior university teacher of physics at the University of Sheffield. And we have Stephen Sandler, head of digital learning, creativity and innovation at the East Barnet School. So before we kick off the discussion, please can I ask each of you to give us a quick introduction to yourself and your background, your work, and also why you feel it's really important to be here having this panel today. So Jessie, can I ask you to start off for us, please?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm Jessie Dufton. And as you said earlier, my title is Principal Patent Engineer. I am very well aware that no one knows what that means. To try and explain it, I work for a company that make hydrogen fuel cells. So for planes, trains, automobiles, anything that currently has an internal combustion engine, we would like to rip that out and run it on a fuel cell. And I look after their patent portfolio for them. So I'm essentially the bridge between the scientists and the engineers and the patent attorneys, which are the specialized technical lawyers that help us to secure our patent applications. In terms of my background, I have got a keen interest in clean energy technology, both fuel cells, and I did my PhD on solar cell materials. And in terms of why I'm talking at the Disability and Science Symposium, so I am blind. I have a genetic eye condition that meant that I was born severely visually impaired, and then it's degenerative. So over time, I've lost what little sight I was born with, and that really kind of came to a head kind of in the first year of my PhD when I lost the ability to read anymore. So yeah, that's probably me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Jessie. And we will be drawing on your experiences as we go through the panel. So thank you for that. Batul, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Batul Dolby, and I'm an educational psychologist, and I'm the principal of CF Psychology, and we are a psychology practice who specialise in providing diagnostic assessments for children and adults with learning difficulties, things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, intellectual disability, ADHD. We provide roughly about 1,000 assessments a year, and actually that number is increasing now as well. So I'm very pleased to be contributing to the panel today, primarily because I'm very passionate about science, and I come from a science background myself as a psychologist. I think just as reading and writing, literacy is part of sort of empowerment through education. I also believe that science is the same, and I think that every person should have a right to learn science, to learn critical thinking, evidence-based thinking, and to learn about the world around them. So I'm very excited to be talking today about some of the invisible barriers that people with learning difficulties may have to accessing that learning.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Batul. And Matt, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Hi. So, hello everyone. My name's Matt. I am a senior university teacher at the University of Sheffield, which is also a job title. People don't always quite understand what it means. Basically, I'm a senior lecturer, but I have an interest in education. So my background was in physics. So I have a PhD in physics, but I've moved into education and pedagogy. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how we make our curriculum inclusive at the university level, but one of the things that I want to kind of talk about and bring to this panel is actually I don't see as many students through my doors who have either a physical or a sensory disability. And obviously there's something amiss here. If they're not getting to university, that's something I want to kind of investigate and look into. The reason why I've been involved personally, not just academically, is I am deaf. I was born almost fully hearing and have a sort of a genetic condition where my hearing loss is progressing to the point that I will probably be profoundly deaf in kind of 10 or so years. So I'm currently using the transcription, which is interesting sometimes. If I giggle, it could be the transcriptions give me a weird word. But I also was diagnosed with bipolar disorder about 15 years ago. So I have a little bit of experience as well around the invisible disabilities, which I also want to bring and learn a bit more about today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I believe that Stephen hasn't been able to join us yet, so we will get him to jump into the panel as soon as we can. But for now, I would like to start off the discussion about these barriers. So, as I say, we're always saying that we don't have enough scientists in the world. In fact, we just do not have enough people going into science, full stop. And if there are barriers preventing some people from doing something that they love, that we need them to be doing, we need to start finding those barriers, finding them early and removing them, finding ways around them. And for educators, this would appear to be the ideal time so that those students can get a good early start into science and have those barriers lessened, removed, or some skills and support to deal with whatever it is that's making it difficult for them to study science. So firstly, I'd like to ask the panel, what kind of barriers do you feel there are to studying science at school and at university? What have you seen? And therefore, obviously going on to pursue a career later on. So Matt, maybe we start with you, because there you are working in a university, and you just said that you mentioned that you're not seeing maybe as many students coming through studying science with a disability as you might expect. So can you share any insights?
Yeah, absolutely. So I said we don't see very many. In the 10 years I've been a lecturer, we have maybe half a dozen, which is certainly below the numbers we'd expect based on the national numbers that we have. What we do find is when we do have students who need additional physical or sensory support, it's often tricky for us to try and figure out what to do. We don't have much guidance telling us what we should do to support a student who is hearing impaired or literally cannot get into the laboratory because the benches are too high, which is a bit of a problem. So the laboratory aspect, I think, is one that is particularly important in STEM, because we know a lot of the learning that happens at school is in the practical side of things, not just in sitting down and kind of going through the equations. So I think there's an area there that needs to be developed a bit. The other part that is harder to pin down, I found, but actually some conversations I've had with students, is that the lived experiences and the time that disabled students have to grapple with quite complex and abstract ideas is a problem. We know that students if you're disabled, you spend a lot of time just living. Okay, there's a lot of energy in doing that. So there's not as much time to sit down and think, okay, what does that equation mean? What was going on here? How do I get my head around this when most of your evening is spent just getting through the kind of the everyday? And that gets a lot more amplified at university, because students go from being at home to living independently. So suddenly the amount of energy they need to expend is significantly higher. So I think there's some of the barriers. There's the practical, which are a little bit easier to fix, I think, when they're identified. And then how do we structure our curriculum and our timetable to give students the time and the space to really think and reflect on their learning.
And you make a good point there about new students, because they have probably at home got all sorts of things worked out to help them with their disability. They have their ways of doing things. They get to university, everything changes. They're in a new place, they're in a new living accommodation, they have to navigate in different ways. So that's also an important point, not just the actual studying science bit, but the change of life that goes around studying science when you move from school to university. So you mentioned quite a few physical barriers there as well, like benches and furniture, and there's an awful lot of kit involved in some areas of science, not all, but quite a few areas of science. You know, screen readers not much use to you in a vacuum cabinet, that kind of thing. So yeah, some really physical barriers. Jessie, can I ask you if you have any personal insights from your school days as to whether you found there were any barriers to studying all the science subjects that you studied?
Yeah, sure. So I think when I was at school, I think the big thing was that I'm feeling a bit old now, but the prevalence of computers wasn't nearly as far progressed as it is today. And for me, it was much harder for me to access things like physical textbooks. You've got to use a physical magnifier, and there's only so much you can enlarge a printed textbook compared to as I got further down my educational curve, more and more of the educational material was digitalized, started to be able to transfer over to from using magnifiers, and as my sight deteriorated further, progressed to using screen readers to kind of read out the information to me, which obviously is a massive help. So I think that that can be the case with some elements of lab work. Matt made a really good point earlier that laboratory work kind of often uses these pieces of equipment which might not necessarily be that accessible. I think in my experience, I did chemistry for my undergraduate and computational chemistry for my PhD. Wet chemistry is much harder to kind of digitize than some other forms of lab work. And I think the key there is a little bit of problem solving. It can be as simple as digital thermometers in place of analog mercury in a tube, because I could never read those. But when I was younger, my eyesight was just about good enough to be able to read a large digital display on a thermometer. Things like other bits of kit, so CCTV magnifiers, which enabled me to kind of look at things in petri dishes under a microscope, because it wasn't really possible for me with the limited sight to use a microscope properly. But if I put it up onto a big TV with a magnifier, that was a much more tractable solution. So I think there's loads of examples where technology can really be a bridge to enable people like myself who struggle with information inputs to be able to kind of access things that would otherwise be difficult because of their disability.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned some really practical things there. It's a case of, for a teacher, where do they go to get these ideas? And of course, we're bound to hit money constraints when we're talking about buying extra kit. But then you mentioned things like digital thermometers. Anyone can use a digital thermometer. It's not a special piece of kit, is it? So it's just increasing accessibility. And that's a brilliant thing to look at, isn't it? That you're not buying special pieces of equipment in a lot of cases. You're merely buying equipment that anyone can use. And we come into this inclusivity bracket. It's what we should all be aiming for anyway. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think also, when I boil it down to the real nub of the problem, it's how do you give the student the information they need in the purest possible form? So essentially making the resources available in a format that is accessible to them and that allows them to use whichever tool they need to be able to access it. So, for example, now I use a screen reader. Screen readers are brilliant. Like, they enable me to interact with the digital world, but they're fragile. They are very dependent on the format of the text that you give them. So I guess from a teacher's perspective, you just need to be really aware of that and realize that it's going to be really important to have study material in a stripped back form, you know, like almost as much as plain text rather than some fancy, you know, proprietary document. Beware of the PDF. Basically, PDFs are the kind of standard, but at an underlying kind of level, there's very little consistency in how that data is structured. So some PDFs, screen readers can read them fine. Other PDFs, it's as if the PDF is just a picture of some text. And when you show that to a screen reader, it goes, well, you're showing me a picture. There's no text here. What do you want me to read? And I think that's a really important point that any kind of educators need to be aware of, the kind of underlying structure of the data that they're giving their students in their educational materials.
Now, of course, if you're on a website, a lot of the time there will be data supporting that picture, won't there? So it will tell you the data about the picture and what the picture is of and why, you know, what that picture is trying to communicate. That's not going to come across in a PDF. So yeah, absolutely hear you there. Thank you. Thank you, Jessie. I want to move on now to talking about some, we called them invisible or unseen barriers. And Batul, I want to bring you in here. When we're talking about the first stage, if you like, is looking around our schools, look at our students and see where those barriers are. And if a student has a physical disability and there is a piece of kit that it's difficult for them to use, it may not be easy to solve, but it is easier to recognize. But Batul, there are cases where students may be struggling with something much more invisible, like, for example, dyspraxia, dyslexia, something that a teacher who only comes into contact with them for a very short time each week may not see or recognize. So how do we get rid of barriers in that case when it may not be easy to see that there's a barrier there? Batul, I think you're muted. If you could just unmute.
Okay.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, so Angela, in terms of sort of thinking about invisible disabilities, which are particularly relevant, I think, to learning difficulties because they are underpinned by cognition, which is not obviously visible from the outside. There is, and this connects actually to something that Matt's observation about, you know, not seeing many students with learning difficulties, learning disabilities coming through into higher education. In fact, there is a chronic problem within the UK of underdiagnosis. So there could be a number of reasons for why Matt is seeing what he's seeing, but it might just be that actually there are lots of students who do have learning difficulties, specific learning difficulties, who just haven't been recognised and don't recognise it in themselves. I mean, I think that there's sort of the barriers there. I mean, firstly, obviously, it's funding. So much comes back to funding. Although, you know, in theory, institutions, organisations have got a responsibility to identify pupil, learners who might have a learning disability. In fact, it doesn't really work out like that. And certainly, I mean, I can speak for schools, which I know well, but within schools, there's such underfunding for special educational needs. It means that pupils who are identified are ones with a very, very high level of need. So pupils with specific learning difficulties like dyslexia just don't get identified because there just isn't the funding there. I don't know about universities. I know that universities are good at screening. They often screen, but only a small number of universities will seem to sort of actually fund diagnostic assessments for pupils. I don't know why that's the case. And of course, that is an equalities issue, because it means that if you're not going to be identified by your school or by your university, then you have to privately commission an assessment for yourself, which is what some people do. But then, of course, we get into sort of equality and the fact that the vast majority of people are not able to sort of access and fund these sorts of assessments. I think the other barrier is just for sort of teachers, lecturers and students themselves, is there's just lack of awareness. People just don't understand these conditions and how they manifest, what to look out for in yourself or what you should be looking out for in your students. There is potentially there is a thing about stigma and labelling as well, that can be also a barrier, I think. And there is also an issue with sort of availability of assessors. So being able to actually see an assessor or refer somebody to an assessor. But I think that's one barrier that, has been overcome through the pandemic, and things like being able to provide remote assessments, which means that you could access an assessor anywhere. I know certainly we assess people all over the UK and abroad now, so that's been a very positive development. Yeah, so I think those are some of the barriers really to identification.
So, Batul, let's say that there's a science teacher who notices one of the bright students, but the work is not maybe reflecting what they feel the potential is of that student, and just wonders if there's something else going on with that student that they're not aware of. What would be that teacher's first port of call to get some advice and to take it forward?
So I think, if we were talking about a school, the first port of call for that teacher would be to raise the student with the school's SENCO. And actually teachers do have a duty to do that. They do have a responsibility to identify and to raise the student with the SENCO. And there should then be a meeting between the teacher and the parents of the child, and hopefully the child as well, to discuss further, the teacher's observations. Within a university, my understanding, and certainly what we see in students that we assess, is that usually a lecturer has raised it with the student. So they've said to the student, I noticed exactly what you said, Angela. I noticed that you're bright, but I've noticed that, for example, you're not able to finish your assessments in time. You appear to be having to put a huge amount of extra work into your study and getting assignments finished. So I think with students at university level, it would be raised, I think, with the student first and discussed with them.
Lovely, thank you. And of course, another unseen barrier to studying science that we haven't discussed yet is certain mental health conditions. You did mention stigma earlier with talking about other conditions, but we know that mental health conditions are something that students are often very reluctant to recognise in themselves, and are therefore maybe not as quick to seek help, to talk about their problems, and therefore there will then be barriers that start to raise themselves, because the student can start to blame themselves and think, I'm just no good at this. Panel, what do you feel we can do about the perceived barriers, if you like, the barriers that the student raises around themselves, either because they're struggling and they don't know why, or because of some bad experiences they've had, being told that they're not good at something, or being told that they're not getting their work in, or it's not the correct standard, and then they start to build the barriers themselves. What can we do about those self-built perceived barriers? Matt, do you want to jump in here? Because by the time you see them at university, a student may have had some, a student with a disability may have had some quite varying experiences throughout their school career. So you were saying that the number of students you get with a disability or a known disability is very small, but have you had any experience of this, that the student just basically telling themselves they're no good?
Yeah, I can speak from personal experience from this as well. It's we do find that we have more students with, as you call them, an invisible disability. Certainly in physics, we find we have the proportion of students is more reflective of society in general. But I do have a lot of conversations with students around, if your work is not good enough, the work that's produced is not good enough, then it's not necessarily a reflection of you. We just know that there are some barriers that we need to try and work around. I think the way that I try to deal with it, and that we try to deal with it, certainly at Sheffield, but I know a lot of other institutions do the same, is around visibility. To try and do that. People are at school, and certainly at university, we give them a lot of responsibility at university, but they are quite young. But we also have to treat them like adults. So telling them, showing them that, okay, we are all diverse. I have a mental health condition that challenges me to this day. I have bad days, I have bad weekends. So I try to be visible and kind of open about this and say, yep, it means that sometimes my work is going to be diabolical. That's okay. We just work around it. So let's try and keep the end game in sight, and let's work around that. But then also try and have conversations with my students. Say, look, tell me if you're having a hard time, we can be flexible. And I realize university is a little bit different to school, where assessment is at the end and it's very timed, whereas I can extend the deadline if I want. But I need the students to talk to me, and we try to be visible about that. But even when there aren't role models available, we try to be very visible about the information around certain conditions and the visibility of our support services. So hopefully students might go, oh, I've seen something online and that resonates with me. That feels like me, sort of. Maybe I need to go and talk to this person. So we make the information visible, we make the signposting visible, and make it clear where the students could go if they think, actually, things are not going well for me.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to just get the audience here to start putting your observations and experiences of barriers where you work, or where you've seen those barriers, into the chat box, if you wouldn't mind, and just share what those barriers have been in the past, and maybe you've found ways of remedying those barriers, whether they are physical, whether they are perceived barriers. Tell us what your experiences are and any practical ways you have started to get over those. Matt, with reference to role models, you were talking about with the perceived barriers, if you like, thinking, oh, I'm no good, and I can't be like them or that person because I have a disability, or I have a learning difficulty, or whatever. It's very interesting. I found a report online commissioned by the Royal Society, came out in January this year. And I was just checking on the number of students at university it's very difficult to get figures from schools, but at university, between the 2007 and 2008 academic year and the 2018-2019 academic year, the number of students with a known disability has increased from 7.5% to 15.5%. So we are maybe making some progress there, not enough, I'm sure, but maybe making a little bit of progress. However, there was a page in the report that I nearly passed straight by, but I stopped, because that said that over the same period, the number of STEM staff, so we are including maths in this, not just science and technology and engineering, but the number of STEM staff at universities with a known disability over the same period had increased, but from 2% to 3.8%, which hardly sounds representative, especially when we're looking for as many role models. I mean, if you're a student at university, someone working at the university is a role model. If you're at school, your teachers are role models for you. What do you think about that representation, if you like, in terms of role models?
I think my thoughts on this are incredibly self-serving, in the sense of being an academic is quite a challenging job, because it requires you to work not only as a teacher, but also as an expert in your research field as well. So you need to be a good teacher, a good researcher, a good member of the department, providing pastoral support for students and for colleagues. So I suppose we find that in this field, if you find that you have a barrier, say at the PhD level or postdoctoral level, having a barrier in one of those things is probably going to prevent you from becoming an academic. So even though you might be a stellar teacher, if you're not able to get the research grant income or publish enough papers in a certain time period, then you're not going to get an academic post. Because unfortunately, the recruitment is still very much, have you got lots of papers? Have you presented at lots of conferences, which are all around the world, so you need to travel there? And have you got all of the money? And also, are you very good at teaching? Are you available between 8 and 6 o'clock every day? All of these things we know are issues for people, not only with disabilities, but for many protected characteristics. So I think we don't have as many role models in STEM, because you only need one of those requirements to being an academic to have a barrier in the way. And then, yeah, we just don't see as many, unfortunately.
Thank you. Jessie, did you have a role model in STEM when you were at school, either at the school or in the wider world, who inspired you?
Short answer is no, I don't think so. I think that's
kind of sad, isn't it?
I'm not sure, maybe. It wasn't something that I sought. So I guess everyone's different, but from my perspective, I was very keen to kind of plough my own furrow, so to speak, and wasn't really in search of a role model. I guess that everyone's different, but I never want my disability to define me. So I'm always kind of pushing it to the background and finding ways that I can, do things like everyone else. So if that meant that I didn't have a role model, I think that's just a personality thing.
Thank you. Yeah, so you knew what you wanted to do and you just forged on and did it. At school, because you talk about having screen readers now, and at school having to use like magnifiers and stuff. Was there any discussion with you as to what you needed, or did people just sort of say, oh, this might be good, or how much discussion was there with you about what you felt you needed when you were at school to help you to study?
Yeah, there was a reasonable amount of discussion, and credit where credit's due. There were some excellent teachers and other kind of educational staff who helped to put in place things that really supported me, because I was never able to read the board. So taking notes was really hard. And there was a way where I was able to get kind of copies of notes, because obviously I wasn't able to write those myself. I think that it was a mixed bag, though. I think that if I was to advise teachers, I would say be mindful of the fact that the student or the disabled person is the only person that really knows what will work for them. So by all means, you know, offer advice and give examples, but the only person who will really know what the right thing to do is the student. And I think that if you have a conversation with a student and basically set out the problem and ask them for their solution, that's a really useful exercise, because it does a couple of things. One, it's a good exercise in problem solving. The student has to solve the problem for themselves. Two, when a solution is found, you automatically have buy-in from the student. It's not like you're imposing a solution on them. You know, human beings don't necessarily like being told what to do if they don't have a say in the process. So getting the student to contribute to a solution kind of buys that automatic buy-in. And yeah, don't be offended if they politely say, that's a really great idea, I'm sure it's worked for other people, but you know, for me, I don't think that's right. Because certainly in my experience, there are a couple of solutions that people suggested to me, and I'm sure they worked for other people, but for me personally, I just didn't find them very helpful. So yeah, just don't take that to heart. If you find yourself in that position, the student says, great idea, but it's not one for me.
But again, that applies to all learners. All learners, whether with a disability or not, have their own way of learning, their own ways that work for them, their own ways of revising. So it's no wonder, is it, that you were very sure about the ways that would work for you, and that something different might work for someone else. But you make a very important point there, which is that the talking and the listening, that actually doesn't cost so much, does it? You know, we hope that people can make the time to discuss this with the learner, be they a student at school or at university, and together discuss and come up with ways that will work for them. So thank you. Now we're getting some experiences and ideas coming in the chat. Lisa says her eldest was diagnosed with dyspraxia at age 18, and from then on got extra time in exams because the exam performance was not reflecting her skills, because her hand just couldn't keep up with her brain. So extra time at uni has helped considerably. So there's a difference between before diagnosis with dyspraxia and after. Batul, can I ask you to come in here and tell me, can it be quite transformational when a student who is just struggling and maybe not knowing why has a name and some strategies?
Absolutely, and this is something that we see just time and time again, how transformational that process is for students, for people of any age, really. But it's interesting, actually. So obviously, when we do an assessment, a diagnostic assessment, I mean, we're looking for both the person's strengths, but also the weak areas, and linking those weaker areas, if you like, to their experiences, the experiences that they're having, and obviously then capitalizing on their strengths in discussing the kind of the reasonable adjustments or different sort of strategies that they may use themselves to help themselves with the problems as they perceive them. And I think, I mean, obviously it's easy talking about people's strengths to them, But actually, I find that people also find it very enlightening to also understand their cognitive weaknesses. And I think it can be, I mean, I think the label is a helpful thing. If you fit into neatly under a sort of label, but not everybody does. The label can be helpful in that it's a kind of identity, and obviously then you have a sort of, you know, I suppose you identify with a sort of group. That can be helpful in terms of sort of being able to discuss with others what works for them. As you said, Jessie, it might work for them, might not work for you, but at least it gives you some sorts of ideas, some starting points. So I think the label can be helpful, but also just knowing that you're, for example, finding out maybe that you have a slower speed of processing. I had one young person who once said to me, you know, knowing that somehow has just allowed me to just say to myself, I'm just going to go at my speed. I know that I'll get there. I'm just going to go at my speed, and just giving myself permission to work more slowly. Sounds like such a simple thing, doesn't it? But actually, it's so empowering for people to just, I mean, it's a little bit like you spoke, Angela, before about sort of mental health. And I think sometimes people will say, you know, when they're diagnosed with depression or anxiety, it's just really helpful for them to be able to say, oh, so I'm feeling depressed. These thoughts that I'm having, or these feelings, that's anxiety. It enables you to kind of externalize it and somehow separate it from who you are, to then be able to recognize those are depressed thoughts that I can kind of somehow kind of, you know, label and you know, and do something about. So I think it's yeah, I think it's very very empowering for people, and very helpful to both to understand their own strengths and weaknesses, and then from there to be able to start to sort of understand themselves, understand their needs, and then also advocate for themselves, because I think that's that's a whole other kind of issue. You know, how do you advocate for yourself, particularly if you've had a whole history of not having your difficulties recognised, of having your self-esteem damaged. I mean, a classic one for me in regard to sort of, you know, learning difficulties is, and this is something that, you know, I think, again, it's just a really simple thing, but young people, spelling, they have their spelling constantly corrected. And for a young person who's dyslexic or dysgraphic, you know, or even dyspraxic, you know, they'll struggle with spelling, but they might be in a science lesson where they could be really good, but they're still getting their, you know, their spelling corrected. And of course that it affects your self-esteem. So
and that also brings us on to another topic, which is people recognizing the ability, not just being distracted by the disability. You said that, you know, that you're having your spelling corrected in maybe a science or a maths lesson where you could absolutely excel at the subject matter, but you're having the way you're writing the subject matter down criticized, which then is a barrier to your progress, because, you know, what the content that was written might have been absolutely brilliant, but you've been criticized about the way you've written it. So it's also important to recognize the ability that's in that piece of work, and not the disability, or in the case you mentioned, just the spelling mistakes and just dismissing them as spelling mistakes, but to recognize the content of that work. And in all cases, to recognize the ability of the student at school and the ability of the student at university, and their potential and their capability, and that the disability may be causing difficulty, but there is so much ability there as well. We need to recognize that, don't we? Okay, so I would like to ask the audience to get involved again. You are continuing to write in your tips and your experiences, which is absolutely brilliant. Talking of challenges with assessed practicals at A level, for example. This is from Chris, talking about the challenges of assessed practicals at A level, particularly with making solutions, writing up calculations, and if the work is moderated, the assessor may not be aware of the full range of challenges faced by a student. So thank you for sharing that with us, Chris. A different Chris, I believe. Oh no, the same Chris, in fact, talking about the Senko and learning support teachers has helped Chris to develop their teaching, and speaking to the student and the parent has helped them to figure out which of the methods will be most beneficial for that student, which is picking up on what Jessie was talking about. Like, every student has their own way of learning, whether they have a disability or not. But that's great. So thank you for that, Chris. And Sahar says, as a physics teacher, the problem was explaining in different ways. And we had another one as well. Oh, Mel, in primary, lots of good practice for children with disabilities is supportive of all young children's learning. And again, that's what we were saying about not necessarily having to do things differently or buy different equipment, but doing things in a way that is inclusive and using kit that is inclusive. Like I think it was Matt mentioned the digital thermometer. Sorry, Jessie mentioned the digital thermometer. So yes, it's a matter of heading towards inclusivity as a general guide, as a general step. So I have a poll as well that I would like you to take part in. And the poll is, does your centre have the facilities enabling inclusivity for those with disabilities when doing practicals? So we've just had the mention there in the chat of the A-level assessment, for example. So does your centre have the facilities enabling inclusivity for those with disabilities when doing practicals? And your options on that poll are strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. So vote now, and we will take a look at how you feel the centres are doing, just as a general measure. So please do vote on that. Okay, so we've got lots of stories coming in, as I say, but I would like to go back to the panel while you're all busy voting, and I would like to ask the panel, each of you, for your top tips. Firstly, on practical things. So I'd like to, we're getting towards the end of the session now, and I'd like to start getting practical. What are your top tips on practical things that people can do to improve learning outcomes in science for those with a disability? So Jessie, can we come to you first, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think my top tip would be, where possible, have a range of different practicals that the students can choose which they do. So for me, obviously I did a chemistry undergraduate. I had to go and do all the wet chemistry, synthetic organic chemistry and mixing solutions, and obviously not being able to see, that's kind of hard. And as soon as I got the choice, I swapped and I did computational chemistry. So I was still doing lab work, as it were, but all the practicals that I chose to do were modeling on a computer using various computer programs, and funnily enough, didn't spill anything in those classes. So yeah, that would be my top tip. Where it's possible, have a range of different practicals that the student can choose between, so that they can steer away from some practicals that their disability might make harder than others.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed. Batul, can I come to you next? What would you suggest as practical things that people can do to improve learning outcomes in science?
Okay, so this is about overall lessons, not just in lessons where you would have practicals. Yeah, so I think, I mean, obviously we've talked quite a bit, haven't we, about the fact that sort of, you know, reasonable adjustments would be specific to the individual, their cognitive profile, and also the particular learning context. So the lesson that they're in, their peer group, the teacher. But I think certainly speaking from the perspective of learning difficulties, it is recognised that actually there are, you know, most people with learning difficulties, specific learning difficulties, they share these things called kind of co-occurring difficulties. So they mostly will struggle with what we call executive function. So those are skills like sort of planning, prioritizing, selective attention, being able to avoid distracting thoughts. So I think there are sort of generic ways that we can improve lessons. I mean, again, these are just things that actually they're just good teaching, but I think there are generic things that you can do in science lessons to support executive functions, and also, you know, address literacy, accommodate for literacy difficulties. I mean, they would be things like, for example, previewing. So given that most people with specific learning difficulties struggle with sort of processing, and they can become easily overwhelmed by too much information, things like previewing really clearly stated learning objectives at the beginning of sessions, which are previewed all together and which are then revisited at the end of the lesson, really cuts down on processing demands. I think also things like pre-teaching technical terms. So in science, you know, particularly if you're having to read or even listen, you know, there is technical terminology. So pre-teaching that before you then go on to read something or listen to an explanation with those words in it will really support processing difficulties. I think also kind of giving visual learning opportunities. So summarizing and revising learning through mind map, through drawing a mind map collectively together as a class, because mind maps get right to the, I think it was you, Jessie, or I can't remember if it was about you were mentioning about the sort of purity of learning. Well, mind maps distill the concepts and gets rid of all the kind of the waffle of language around it. Also giving practical opportunities to learn through doing gets people moving. It really helps with attention, helps to focus attention. So I think those would be my my top tips. And obviously allowing people to use assistive technologies like their word processors, reading software, speech to text, things like that in lessons too. I could go on.
Excellent. And yet we would be out of time if you did, but lots of great practical pointers there, Batul. Thank you very much indeed. And lastly, Matt, can I ask you to give us your top tips, please?
My top tip is to realise that you're not alone, which sounds very, very vague and woolly. The reason I say that, and it picks up on what Jesse was talking about with his experience of doing an experiment computationally. At university, we have a lot of people who are very skilled at this, and you might have a teacher thinking, I don't know how to do this. How would I even start? I would say look out for people that you can get in touch with, speak to universities, apply pressure to places like to Pearson to go, okay, if there's one student in your school that needs it, there's probably a good number around the country who would also benefit from this. So if somebody was to talk to me even about how do I make my mathematical equations accessible to a screen reader, we do this all the time. So we have a lot of experience we could share. So don't feel like you're one teacher trying to make adjustments for one student. We could be a good source of kind of ways that you can kind of support your students. And also, I mean, realistically, if you come to an academic with a good idea, that could be something to pursue and research, we will jump on it. So take advantage of us in that way. I would love to hear from teachers that want new ways to teach in an experimental lab. I will happily use my own time, because it's part of my job to do that, to try and develop these things that could be kind of shared more widely. So don't feel like you're alone in doing this. Come and talk to us and maybe network with others around the country.
Fantastic. So collaboration. So we've got some brilliant top tips for you there from our panel, who have got a wealth of experience. We've also got things coming into the chat, which we don't have time to discuss now, sadly. But for example, Sahar says micro teaching worked great. I was amazed at the results. So there's another thing to explore. But we've got some really good tips from our panel. And thank you all for your experiences and your questions. We're pretty much out of time now, so I just want to very quickly summarize some of the ground we've covered and collect together some of the more practical ideas and thoughts. So we've discussed the barriers to studying science, and we kind of categorized them, if you like, into physical or practical barriers. So needing to look at access, table heights was mentioned, using equipment, and maybe providing a range of experiments for students to do, so that they can do the experiment that works for them and their type of learning. We discussed unseen or invisible barriers, so something that a teacher may not spot at first, that even a student may not spot at first. And we were saying that that really needs a better diagnosis. If you've got somebody who's not fulfilling their obvious potential, then that needs to be the start of a conversation, maybe with the SENCO and the student. We've also talked about perceived barriers by the student themselves, because past experiences and difficulties have maybe led them to rule themselves out of doing things a little bit. You know, I can't do that, or they won't want me because of their past experiences. So we need some better support and encouragement, more recognizing of the ability rather than the disability, and maybe some more high profile role models, and some discriminatory barriers as well. Maybe people who haven't recognized an ability and have just criticise that student, and that has made them feel like putting those barriers up. So if we allow a disability to prevent someone from pursuing their thing, then we're losing out on all of their abilities just because of their disability. We're losing out on their perspective, their talent, their experience, and we're missing out on the company of them in the workplace. And that just doesn't make sense at all, does it? So definitely inclusivity is the way to go. And as we approach the International Day of People with Disabilities, that is a week on Friday, so Friday the 3rd of December, let's make that an opportunity for you, you who have attended this webinar, so you've shown your interest in inclusion and diversity, to maybe chat to your colleagues on the International Day for People with Disabilities. Chat to your colleagues about what can be done to recognise and encourage the many awesome abilities that people with a disability may have. So thank you so much to my panelists, Jessie, Batul and Matt. They were absolutely fantastic panelists and brought a wealth of experience and expertise. And of course to you for your questions and comments in the chat. So do join us again for another Pearson event on diversity and inclusion. And thank you for joining us. Have a very good evening.